QuickBooks Online 2021, Job, Subcustomer, and Project. Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Online 2021. Here we are in our Get Great Guitars practice file. We're going to be taking a look at jobs, subcustomers, and projects, just providing an overview, a quick look at these items, noting that these are kind of specialized items that could be applicable to a particular type of industry, possibly a job cost type of system where you're tracking jobs or tracking projects. Also note that if we're using some kind of tracking of projects or a job cost type of system, QuickBooks Online has a lot of different tools now to do this kind of thing. So there's different ways that we can actually achieve the same goal or similar goals, or different ways that we might approach things to get to similar type of results. So that's really good, and it's also a little bit complex because when you think about how am I going to set up this particular system, you could do it multiple ways. So we're going to touch in on that a little bit. There's also some terminology issues as well with regards to jobs and sub-customers and whatnot, and projects. So we'll talk about some terminology here as well. And then possibly after the full practice problem, we might go into some of this information in more detail. We have full courses on a job cost system and whatnot because that is a whole topic in and of itself. If you're a bookkeeper, then you want to be determining, do you want to be dealing with clients that are setting up jobs and working with projects, and what's going to be, your best system? What type of industry do you want to be in, and how can then you best serve the customer by mapping out what it is you do within that particular industry? So let's go down here first into the sales tab on the left-hand side. We're going to go into the customers up top. Now, it might be the case down here we have our customers that we want to basically break out certain jobs. And oftentimes this would happen if we have a longer job or a longer project. So the classic example would be like a construction company or something like that, where you're working on a longer period of jobs, and therefore you want to track the expenses and whatnot and the revenue to a particular job, or you can call it to a particular project, so you can see how that particular project or job is doing. And then added on to that, because there's an extended format between the point in time that you start the job and end the job, meaning it's not going to be complete, you kind of have a revenue recognition type of problem, because usually you recognize revenue when the job is done. But if your job is going to be like a year long or a long job, then you're probably going to get payments, as the job goes. And then you got to think about, well, should I be recognizing revenue kind of as I go? Do I use a completed contract method, or do I use a percentage of completion method? And those type of issues come up as well. So like I said, we won't get into a lot of detail in that kind of issue. We're just going to think about what if we have these extended kind of jobs. Service companies could also have a similar kind of issue. If you think about a CPA firm, like a partnership, or if you think about, someone that just does the taxes, or we think about audits, or if we think about law firms, they have similar kind of issues. They're going to possibly take on an engagement. They might take on multiple engagements with one company and have multiple different engagements in which they want to track things. We might be doing the tax return. We might be doing an audit or something like that. A legal firm might be taking on a particular engagement and want to track the expenses and whatnot and bill separately based on one job versus another job. So that would mean that we would then want to set up some kind of thing to be tracking this. Now, our options then are to have a sub-customer here, or we could possibly use the projects feature, which is kind of the new interesting way to be tracking this, and it gives you some different looks at the way you might take a look at it. Now, when we think about the sub-customer, which we'll start off with, if I add a sub-customer, that's kind of similar to what jobs would be called in QuickBooks Desktop. So let's just, terminology-wise, QuickBooks Desktop, we would call it a job. In the QuickBooks Online, we're going to call it a sub-customer. Let's just jump over to the desktop equivalent just so we can get an idea of that. If we go to the desktop equivalent and I was to go to the customer center, then we would add like a job, and you'd hit the drop down up here and add a job, and then you could tie that to the customer. So we'd add, a job here, and then I could just say it's job 401. I'm just going to call it a number, and it would be then tied to that customer. So for whatever reason, they didn't use that same kind of functionality or that same term, possibly over here because they're trying to recognize maybe with QuickBooks Online that you could do a similar thing with different tools like projects, or you could use locations to do some of the things, or classes to do similar types of things. So in QuickBooks Online, let's say that we're going to make a sub-customer for Jones Guitars. Instead of selecting Jones Guitars and creating the sub-customer, we could just go back up top and say we want to say new customer and the green tab, And then I'm just going to call it a name here. So I'm just going to, or a number. I'm going to call it 3005. And then I'm going to say it's a sub customer. So we're going to check this item saying sub customer. And then I want to say it's a sub customer here of Jones Guitars. So Jones Guitars. And then you have the option, do you want to bill it with the parent, or you bill this customer, like bill the job separately? And typically the default is to bill with the parent. So I'm going to keep it there at the bill with the parent. And then that's going to be it. We'll save it and close it. And now you have a similar layout where you have the name here, and then you got the sub job or the sub customer line underneath it here. So now let's duplicate this tab. I'm going to right click on this tab up top and duplicate it. And note we can assign some things now to the sub customer if we wanted to. So we could say, okay, what if I was going to make an invoice, for example? I won't actually make one, but if I was to say what would happen if I was going to generate an invoice here, I'm going to make it go to the sub customer now of the 3005. And then we have our sub customer, and notice how it lines up. It's still billed under the Jones Guitars and then the sub customer number. So we can assign basically the income out then to the sub customer. I'm going to close this back out without recording it. And then we can do similar things to like an expense type form or a check type form, where we might use then something that we were going to have as billable down here and then assign it out to a customer that we're going to assign out. And then once again, we have the sub customer there, which we could then use to pull over to say an invoice, assigning that out. We could then run reports, for example. If we go down to the reports on the left-hand side and we want to run a report, and we could say that you can do the profit and loss by customer, which you could do down below. You could just make it go into the profit and loss, standard profit and loss report, and then hit the drop down. Instead of by totals, you want to make it by customer. And so you just change that item there, run the report, and now we got our profit and loss by customer, which if there was any activity in the sub customer should hopefully include the sub customer, which will help us to track that out. Also note that if I wanted to then filter these items, we could use the filter, and then we can use the customers filter, and we could select possibly the customers that we want to be tracking. So those are some ways that we can manipulate the reports here that could be by customer. Let's go back to the first tab, and I'm going to go back to the sales tab again, go into the customers up top. And let's do this for another one. So now let's say that we want 4002 for Sam the Guitar Man. So I'm going to make a new customer again. And again, I'm just going to call it a number here. So I'm just going to say number, which is going to be 4002. Say it's a sub customer of Sam the Guitar Man. Sam the Guitar Man. And that's going to be it. And we're going to say it's going to be bill with the parent. So we'll keep that as is and say save it and close it. So now we have a similar functionality down here where once again we can assign things out to the actual sub customer, or you could think of it as basically a job kind of functionality. Now again, if I go to the second tab over here, you can think about this type of report, and notice we have different columns up top, different columns by the customers. You could think of using a similar kind of layout when you think about these column layout with classes. If you looked at a profit and loss by class, you could do a similar thing, and you can assign a class to particular items so that you could track basically the income and expenses by class. You also have a similar feature if the thing is broken out by location, where you could basically use, a location and kind of feature, which is similar to a kind of a class feature, and use those options. We also then have the projects option. So this is kind of a newer type of thing that can track things and give you a nice little window into what's going on just basically in the projects feature right here. It gives you a quick overview of what is going on. Again, the projects are different than a job. So when you think about this, you could think, okay, a job for QuickBooks Desktop is basically a sub customer for QuickBooks Online. But if you're running like a job cost type of system or something where you want to track projects, then you could use like sub customers, which are kind of like jobs for QuickBooks Desktop, or you might use the project feature, or you might use kind of classes to do a similar functionality. Once you have your sub customer set up, it is possible to kind of transfer them over into a projects if you would like to use the projects field, but you want to be really careful with that, because if you just transfer them over, you might lose the data as you pull the information over. So you can either merge it or you can transfer it over. So you want to make sure that you be careful if you want to go from like a system where you were using the sub customers over to the projects, to make sure that you're pulling over the data. And I think you have to do like a merger technique in order to do that more efficiently. We might go into that in more detail later. That would be a kind of a topic in and of itself. But let's go ahead and start a project. And let's say we had a project. Once again, the project's going to be different than the job. And let's say we're going to have a similar thing for the project. I'm going to say name this one 500. And we're going to assign this, say, we'll assign it to string music. So string music. And we'll go ahead and save the project here. So now we have a kind of a project layout, and it gives you this overview of your project at a glance, see your project's performance, end-to-end, track income and all your costs. So it's really good for like the internal tracking of a particular project and just visually seeing it right here in this section. So follow the money, see your project organized by income and cost to make sure you stay profitable. I'm going to say next. And then see how time is being spent. You can add your team's time and know what they worked on. So you can basically apply the time here. That's one of the things that you might want to apply then to the project. Multiple views of the project, drill into the details, manage and report on what has been spent, how much has been invoiced, and identify your next step. So we're going to say, okay, and then we got the add a project feature over here. So there it is. So now we have our project basically assigned. And we could do some of our work that's going to kind of be related to the project basically in here. So I can add project, I can add the invoice here. And if I add the invoice here, it'll already be basically assigned out to the particular project. So you see we have the similar process, string music, and then the 500. If I hit the drop down, you can see the difference here between a project and a sub-customer. So these are two different things that you got to keep in your mind, that they're going to be different, right? So we have the project down here. Obviously, you could just, if I close this out, create an invoice up top and just make a new invoice up top and then assign it out to the project, which would be 500. And so there's the project. You could do it that way as well, but I'm going to close this back out. It's nice though that you can work kind of within the project and you can go in here and then receive payment expenses and you can kind of track everything within the project and look at the reports in the project specifically. So again, we might go into more detail on these different functionalities on using projects and using sub-customers possibly, or a job cost system in more detail. We just want to point them out at this point in time. And just remember that if you're going to go into tracking projects or you're going to go into tracking jobs in some way, you really want to think before you start whether or not you're going to use sub-customers, whether you're going to use projects, whether you'd like to use class tracking in some way, or the locations tracking feature. And there's no best way sometimes. There might for some industries or some areas it might be easier to use one method or another, or you could combine some of those methods together. What becomes more difficult is transferring from one thing to the other. So if you've had one system such as sub-customers and you've decided you want to transfer them to projects, then it gets a little bit more tricky. You want to make sure that you're doing that transfer as cleanly as possible. And once again, that might be the most common transfer oftentimes because people might move from like a desktop version, for example, where they use the jobs feature and try to transfer the data into QuickBooks Online, which means the comparable area here would be the sub-customer, and then possibly moving from the sub-customer to the projects, which, because that's the newer kind of thing here. And if you were to do that, then you want to make sure that you're pulling over the data that you need, or that you're understanding where the cutoff is as you start using projects going forward from one point in time. And you want to make sure to do the research on that before you do it. I think if you merge over the data, it can pull over some of the data. We might go into that in more detail in future presentations, but it's beyond the scope of this general problem here.